The emperor had taken care to have justice and the forms of law on his side, and he trusted to the prospect of eventually removing the prejudices to which the pope's mind had given way. He sent him a deputation composed in the first instance of 4 prelates, who were the Abbé du Vassin, Bishop of Nantes, Monsieur Burrell, Archbishop of Tours, Monsieur de Beaumont, Archbishop of Bourges, and the Bishop of Treves. The 4 prelates repaired to Savona, where they stayed nearly a month. They were no doubt provided with answers to all the arguments that might be opposed to them, but their mission had more particularly for its object to come to a definitive arrangement on some points of ecclesiastical discipline which were in France the subject of unceasing vexations. The Pope, for instance, refused in his displeasure to give bulls to the bishops who were appointed by the emperor to any vacant sees. The result was that the vicars capitular were the real bishops, and were almost all in opposition to principles to the bishop who was sent to them. The disorganization gradually extended to religious houses, and was beginning to reach the houses of education in many parishes. No apprehension was felt for the consequence of refusing to sing the Domine Salvum after Mass. I was never made acquainted with the details of the conferences at Savona, but I heard from one of the respectable prelates who had been a member of the deputation that the Pope had not swerved from the idea which exclusively possessed his mind. He insisted upon returning to Rome, and confined himself to this answer, "A Roma, a Roma," in reply to every observation made to him, which was as much as to say that his temporal power should first be restored to him, and he would then consider what was proper for him to do. In vain were the interests of the faithful, and the repose of the state represented to him. The burden of his song was always "A Roma." He never departed from that point. He observed, however, that he could not give any reply without consulting his council, or the cardinals, whom I have just named, but with them we had a very different account to settle. Before entering upon this topic, I must finish what relates to Savona. The prelates, being unable to obtain anything, took leave of the Pope and returned to Paris. It is a remarkable circumstance that, in the case in which the strongest mind might err, and the best memory be at fault, in case which had challenged the inquiries of the most learned theologians, and caused so many books to be referred to for the last 6 months, the Pope confined himself to reading his breviary and counting his beats. He never opened a book, and will it be shortly seen in what manner he spent his time. The emperor was much disappointed at the return of the bishops to Paris. He again reflected and held a consultation on the subject matter of a second message which was sent to the Pope during the winter. The bearers of it were the same bishops as before, to which 2 were added the Archbishop of Mechlin, and I believe Monsieur de Osmond, who was Bishop of Nancy, or Archbishop of Florence. I do not exactly recollect which of the 2 sees he occupied. This affair of the Pope, in which such gratuitous injustice was shown to the emperor, is, in my opinion, one of the circumstances in which he displayed the greatest degree of patience. If the Pope had been in contact with the King of England or an emperor of Russia, he would not have given a moment's uneasiness. But such was the virulence of animosity against the emperor that atheists took part for the Holy Father with as much warmth as devotees themselves. It will now be seen how far the patience of the emperor was carried, and what knowledge he had of the secret machinations of the Roman priesthood when he sent a second message to Savona. This was the first time in which I had anything to do with priests. I was almost certain of succeeding in what I was about to undertake, for I had sent into different parts of France and priests devoted to my interests, and the greater part brought me back word that what was called the Petite Église had a predominating influence almost everywhere. The name of Petite Église was given to that church, which was attended by priests who rejected the Pope's authority and whose avowed sentiments were nevertheless in accordance with those contained in the bull of excommunication. Ever since the Civil War, some of those priests were known to travel all over France, administering the sacraments of baptism, confession, and communion, celebrating marriages, and divine service in private houses to which their flocks would each repair with their little contributions. And this was to them the main point, for whilst abusing the credulity of the country people, those fanatics were not unmindful of the object of raising a tax upon them. The Duke of Otranto had wholly neglected this source of discord, which had already created great mischief when I gave my attention to it. I had succeeded in causing the arrest of many of those priests who, since 1793, had been sent into the western provinces by the Committee of Bishops established in London, and who, ever after that period, were acting in France the part which was least expected from men of their profession. I sent for these priests, who were absolute idiots, and determined to suffer martyrdom for trifles. I could obtain from them no avowal of anything but what related to themselves personally, such as that they re-administered the sacraments of baptism, confession, marriage, etc. to those country people who had been attended by such of the clergy as had acknowledged the concordat. In the search after those priests, the soldier was arrested who, perceiving the stupidity of his neighbors, had taken into his head to pass himself off for a priest. He had traveled and received a good education, and accordingly set about confessing, baptizing, and saying Mass, a trade much more lucrative to him than that of a soldier. He was thrown into prison, but no harm was done to him. The report, however, of this adventure was injurious to the true priests of the Petite Église. Everyone being afraid of hearing a soldier's mass, I was the more pleased at the occurrence as it proved of such service to me. The emperor had often mentioned the Petite Église to me, and strongly urged me not to relax my inquiries. He was greatly pleased at this early success, which I have noticed previously too, relating the following circumstance, though totally unconnected with it. The emperor had an extraordinary talent for discovering the source from whence emanated any influence detrimental to his interests. He seldom erred when he relied upon his own impressions. He had 3 months before directed me to be on the lookout for a bull or instruction, which the Pope was understood to have circulated amongst the French clergy. There was a moral proof of its existence. The very clauses of it were found to be actually in practice, but the great difficulty was to lay hands upon it. The physiognomy of priests is generally apt to deceive. I should have failed in my researches had it not been for a casual occurrence which led to a full discovery of the matter. We had reached the 1st of January, when the constituted bodies came to pay their respects to the emperor. The clergy of Paris presented themselves at the audience. The see of this metropolis had been held since the death of Cardinal de Belloy by Cardinal Fesch, who had afterwards tendered his resignation, and been succeeded by Cardinal Maury. But as this prelate was without any bull of investiture, the vicars capitular of the chapter performed all the duties belonging to the diocese. It was necessary, therefore, to seek amongst them for what it was wished to discover. There was, in fact, some probability that an agent of the court of Rome had applied to Abbé Marie, who maintained, however, an opinion contrary to that court. Abbé Destros, one of the vicars of the chapter of Paris, was the principal agent of the metropolitan chapter. He was present with the clergy of the diocese and himself uttered the complimentary expressions addressed by the deputation to the emperor, who listened patiently to it and afterwards spoke to him with great composure respecting the dissensions of the clergy. I cannot take upon myself to say whether the emperor already possessed any positive information. If so, I did not furnish it. Certain it is that he had touched the tender part. He brought the conversation home to Monsieur Destros, who was at a loss to understand why the emperor so pointedly selected him. He thought himself betrayed and took the alarm without, however, uttering a single word that was calculated to compromise him. At the conclusion of this audience, which was soon over, the emperor returned to his closet, where he desired me to follow him. And after telling me what had taken place between him and the abbé, and what were his own misgivings on the subject, he desired me to follow up the business. Not a moment was to be lost. Everyone was retiring from the place when it occurred to me to send Cardinal Marie word that I wished to have a conversation with him, and requested he would call upon me on leaving the Tuileries and contrive to bring Abbé Dastros along with him. I returned home and sent a very dexterous agent to Monsieur Dastros, desiring him not to lose a moment to visit every corner of his apartment, and not to overlook anything that was likely to contain a single sheet of paper. Whilst my orders was carrying into effect, Cardinal Marie and Monsieur Dastros arrived. The latter, still alarmed at the questions put by the Emperor to him, I assumed the air of a man who was already well informed of everything, which was by no means the case. I told Monsieur Dastros that I allowed him half an hour to decide upon telling me from whence he had received the papers, which had just been found at his house, and to what purpose he intended them. He hoped to elude my inquiry by replying that he did not intend to make any use of them, and that he was not acquainted with the name of the person who had brought them to him. This answer put me quite at my ease, for I never knew before that he had any papers. I took advantage of this communicative disposition and got him to name the persons to whom he had shown the papers. He at first refused to name anyone when he was told to be on his guard, as he could only have been brought into his present position by someone who had a knowledge of everything. And it was clear that something must have been disclosed, since the clue had been afforded for discovering the object sought for. He then named the vicar capitular of his own diocese and Mr. Portalis, a disclosure which greatly indisposed the emperor towards this counselor of state, who, being entrusted with a secret, the tendency of which was to disturb the public tranquillity, had neglected to divulge it. He was the more hurt at this conduct, as he could not forget the father's services, and if he made a severe example of the son by dismissing him from the council of state, he did it much more with the view of setting an example than a punishment for the error. Mr. Dastros refused to make any farther disclosure. I was then put into possession of the result of the domiciliary visit made at his residence, where, in fact, very extraordinary papers had been found. Mr. Dastros admitted that they belonged to him, but he was not aware that they were not in my possession at the time of my sending for him. There were amongst his papers many private letters, of which I compelled him to name the authors. When he had complied with my wishes, I declared to him that he could not be set at liberty until I was informed of everything. These papers, though rather voluminous, had been found concealed partly in the pockets of an old cassock, which was hung up in his wardrobe, and partly in a muff-box. They consisted of the famous bull and of a lengthy instruction from a pope's legate. We thereby ascertained that on quitting Rome, the pope had left his powers to a priest who issued his mandates to the whole of Christianity, and whose orders were implicitly obeyed. The existence of this invisible chief explained to us how it happened that we had everywhere to encounter a uniform system of opposition and malignity on certain points of discipline and dogma. Monsieur Dastros obstinately refused to state from whom emanated the instruction, which was without any signature, but it was accompanied by minutes of letters written in his own hand, which afforded proof of his having had to consult some chief on different points of ecclesiastical discipline, no doubt with the view of screening himself from responsibility. Unfortunately for him, he had written to that chief to know whether he could conduct the chapter to the emperor with the cross elevated. That's to say, with the cross which takes the lead in every procession. He earnestly solicited an early reply because Cardinal Marie, who went frankly to work, insisted upon its being carried, and Monsieur Dastros, who was apprehensive of incurring censure, wanted to consult his chief previously to giving his assent. The reply of that chief was also to be found amongst the papers which had been seized. It was even accompanied by an explanation, which must have been preceded by questions and replies so closely following each other that the chief was evidently at no great distance. His writing and style farther disclosed that he was an Italian, but Monsieur Dastros would never consent to name him. I resorted to a stratagem for discovering who he was. As the letters were only dated 2 or 3 days back, I ascertained from the servant of Monsieur Dastro's that he had carried them to one Father Fontana, an Italian, who, since the expulsion of the cardinals, had retired to a convent of nuns in Paris. I sent for this friar, who named another, also native Italy. The latter, I think, was called Antonio, and had also retired at the same period to a community of nuns, the name of which has escaped my recollection. Father Fontana admitted the letters written to him by Monsieur Dastros, of which I showed him the copies, as well as his replies annexed to them. To avoid details which would be tedious for the reader, suffice it to state, as a result of the admissions of these priests, that ever since the cardinals had been removed from Paris, they had themselves decided every difficult point in church matters, in pursuance of an instruction similar to the one found amongst the papers of the Abbé Dastros. They said that they had received that instruction since the Pope was at Savona, but not from himself. These priests had excited my curiosity without gratifying it, when it occurred to me to ask how they would have acted had any case presented itself which was not provided for by their instruction, one of dogma, for instance, instead of one of mere discipline. They replied that they would have referred it to the College of Cardinals, and finished by acknowledging that such a case had actually happened, and they had written to Cardinal Di Pietro respecting it. Cardinal Di Pietro was the Pope's prime minister. The Pope had confided his powers to him on quitting Rome, and he was the person who, when in Paris, had prevented the other cardinals from attending the ceremony of the emperor's marriage. He had been banished from Paris with the other cardinals, and was then at Semur in Burgundy, where I sent for him. He was closely questioned by Monsieur Real, to whom the emperor had directed me to confide the farther management of the business. Cardinal Di Pietro was obliged to acknowledge everything, that he performed the Pope's functions, and on leaving Paris had given his instructions to the 2 Italian priests and to Monsieur Dastros for their guidance. Thus it was that the ministers of a God of peace took advantage of their profession to disturb the state and the privacy of every family by alarming the consciences of honest men and encouraging those who wavered in their evil designs. In every other country but France, the government would have punished those priests as enemies to the public tranquility. They were merely confined as dangerous madmen. The further proceedings in this affair led to the discovery of a line of correspondence between Paris and Savona, and to the consequent imprisonment of some priests who were the bearers of it, and who carried to the very extremities of Belgium the democratical instructions of Cardinal Di Pietro. This discovery gave me the idea of proceeding on the lookout for all the inferior Roman priests who had come to Paris in the train of the cardinals, and I found the greater part of them habited in a secular dress and teaching Latin, Italian, or music. The devotees had vied with each other in showing them every attention. I caused them to be strictly watched, and soon found that their morals were greatly relaxed, and that it was dangerous for families to give admission to men of such perverse morals, who profited of the free access they had obtained to introduce a species of immorality until then unknown in France. Some of those families, however, had no right to complain of them, for they had, as it were, courted the evil out of pure party spirit. Nevertheless, I made no stir in the business, but collected the treasonable letters which some of these hypocrites had written to young men, and I communicated their contents to the parents of the latter. This precaution was sufficient to procure their early dismissal, with a few exceptions, and they ceased from thenceforward to be dangerous men. This affair of the priest was of essential service to the administration in general, because the mischief which is known is at all times less to be apprehended than which is concealed. Means were found to arrest the consequences of it, and if during the last 12 months that this criminal intrigue was at work, it had been interrupted in its progress, it would not have done all that mischief in France, which proved so detrimental to us in our reverse of fortune. A coloring of oppression was given to the measures resorted to for repressing this intrigue. May I not ask What would be done in England to a Roman Catholic bishop who, in virtue of secret powers from the Pope, should use the sacredness of his calling to foment in the kingdom a system of intrigue calculated to throw the country into a state of confusion? Chapter 8. The emperor's kindness even towards his personal enemies was always carried to excess. I will cite an instance of it, which came under my own observation and occurred immediately after this affair of the priesthood. I was informed in the course of the winter that a family of great distinction in Dresden felt extremely uneasy at the resolution formed by a young man of 20 years of age connected with it by the ties of relationship, who had suddenly left the University of Halle or of Leipzig, where he was prosecuting his studies, and had taken his passport for Frankfurt on the Main, from whence he would probably penetrate into France. I was also informed that this young man was very light-headed and had quitted the Lutheran creed to embrace the Catholic religion. The notice given was short and the information extremely vague. I should have failed to make any discovery had not one of my agents written by the same courier to apprise me of the passage to that town of a young Saxon named Wundersal on his way to Paris. He added that the Saxon had taken up at Frankfurt a letter of credit upon Paris. I could plainly see that he distorted the name of the young man who, according to my calculation, must have been 2 days in Paris. And I caused every search to be made after him by the prefecture as well as by the Ministry of Police. I issued this order on a Sunday morning at the hour of 10 and ordered an application to be made to all the banking houses which were understood to correspond with Germany, for the names of all those in whose favor they had been directed to open a credit. For the last 5 or 6 days, I was immediately furnished with a list of names and remarked, amongst the rest, the German name of Wundersohn, having a credit from Frankfurt of such a date with the name of the street and hotel where he was to be found. He was accordingly met at his hotel towards 5 o'clock in the evening of the same day. 4 pair of pistols and a dagger were discovered in his apartment, and he had confessed himself and received the sacrament. When he entered my apartment, I was much more disposed, as I looked at his handsome countenance, to speak to him of balls and amusements than of more serious matters. I had besides nothing but suspicion to act upon, and was forced to assume a disguise in order to get at the truth. I spoke morality to the young man, and forcibly dwelt upon the irreparable disgrace which attended a wicked action, especially when committed by a person of his distinguished birth. He colored, became embarrassed, and with that candor of mind which indicates innocence from guilt, he at last acknowledged what had been his intention in coming to Paris. He had resolved to kill the emperor, in order, by coupling their names together, to immortalize his own. I asked him how it happened that he was not arrested by the difficulties which he must have foreseen, and of which he now had a clear proof. He calmly replied that whether he succeeded or not, he knew that his own death was certain, that he had prepared himself to render an account of his actions to God, and that if he had missed his aim, another would have followed his example, and by profiting of the experience which had been wanting to him, would avoid the obstacles in the way of success. He added that Henry IV had been missed on 22 occasions, but the 23rd attempt was successful. The emperor had only been missed 3 or 4 times. This failure was not enough to arrest a man of courage, who only reckoned his life as of any value so long as he could render it useful. His own life would have been sufficiently well employed, in so far as it would have promoted by one more chance the probabilities of success for those who might wish to tread in his footsteps. It was difficult to carry to greater lengths than this young man had done the readiness to sacrifice oneself in order to commit a criminal action. I made a written report to the emperor of whatever had preceded and followed the arrest of the young Saxon, whose intentions admitted no longer of any doubt. The emperor wrote in the margin of my report by the hand of his secretary, "This affair must be kept concealed in order to avoid the necessity of publicly following it up. The young man's age must be his excuse. None are criminal at so early an age unless regularly trained to crime." That's true. In a few years his turn of mind will alter, and Vain would be the regret of having sacrificed a young madman and plunged a worthy family into a state of mourning to which some dishonor would always be attached. Confine him in the castle of Vincennes, have him treated with all the care which his derangement seems to require. Give him books to read, let his family be written to, and leave it to time to do the rest. Speak on the subject with the Arch-Chancellor, whose advice will be of great assistance to you. In consequence of these orders, young von der Sohn was placed at Vincennes, where he was still confined on the arrival of the Allies in Paris. The misconduct of the Roman priests, which had forced itself upon the emperor's notice, was not calculated to induce him to relax in his project of shaking off the papal yoke. On this occasion, he caused a work to be composed by Monsieur Daunou, which had for its title Historical Remarks on the Encroachments and the Temporal Power of the Popes. He said, in speaking of them, I should much rather turn Lutheran tomorrow than set France again on fire by restoring in our country the truly monstrous power of those hypocrites. The emperor entered, unfortunately, too much into the details of petty affairs, which it had become a practice to communicate to him. His ministry was less attentive to business than formerly. The most insignificant points in those affairs caused a reference to be made to him. He was thus often called away from serious occupations to dwell upon trifles, which ought never to have been mentioned to him until the business had been fully gone through. He was therefore unable to attach to matters of moment that importance which they demanded, and lesser matters, on the contrary, grew into undeserved importance. If the emperor had not been called away to subjects which engrossed his whole attention, he would have terminated the papal affairs in such a manner that the result would have been ranked amongst the most useful labors of his administration, but owing to the business having been left in an incomplete state, had been represented as an enterprise altogether tyrannical in its nature, whilst every Catholic country would have acknowledged its debt of gratitude to him had his views been carried into effect. It was much to be regretted that an uninterrupted series of important wars brought on a never-ending succession of embarrassments and withdrew the emperor from those occupations on which he had so fully set his mind. During the interval from the Peace of Luneville to the rupture of the Peace of Amiens, there was a period when the budget of receipts exceeded the expenditure by upwards of 40 or 50 millions of francs, and when the emperor had, besides, in his own coffers, a saving derived from foreign contributions and from his personal economy, which did not fall short of 250 or 300 millions. If with this had been coupled the blessing of peace, there was wherewith to render France a spacious museum of everything that ingenuity and art are capable of inventing for the glory and happiness of mankind. We might lose ourselves in gloomy reflections which are not the objects contemplated in this work if we opened a chapter of what has been wrongfully done and of what ought to have been done, but wholly neglected. Whilst the police of Paris was unraveling the evil machinations of the priesthood, the emperor was sending his second message to the Pope. It was as unsuccessful as the first, and it may boldly be asserted that the Pope possessed a mind which was in every point of view inadequate to the situation in which the march of human reason had thrown the affairs of the Church. He only contemplated his own personal situation and obstinately refused to separate it from the spiritual question. The course of events came to favor his views. The conclave may perhaps canonize him, but history will pass judgment on his deserts. Chapter 9. It was at the commencement of this winter that several banking and mercantile houses fell into difficulties which were only occasioned by the embarrassments of their correspondents, whose affairs had suffered in consequence of their resistance to the measures attempted to be leveled at commerce of England. In Holland, the principal houses were winding up their affairs and discontinuing them altogether. In Belgium, a system of extensive fraud had been discovered, which had assumed the character of a tolerated traffic. Not only was it arrested in its progress, but a rigid investigation had been made of the books of every commercial house which had embarked in it, and they had been fined the whole amount of the duties of which they had evaded the payment. This discovery brought on the ruin of many who had sold their merchandise in consequence of the facilities they had found for introducing them. But it did no injury to the English houses, which were already reimbursed of what had been owing to them. These measures had had the effect of causing considerable alarm. Each one contracted the sphere of his business. Capitalists withdrew their funds, and there was a moment when some houses of great respectability stood in need of money, although their stores were full of goods, because they could not find a vent for them. The emperor ordered several reports to be made to him on the subject of those commercial difficulties, and they all came to the conclusion that the greater part of the merchants involved had not fallen into them in consequence of the withdrawing of the capitals entrusted to their management, but owing to their having given to their operations an extension wholly disproportioned to their means, and of having been accordingly compelled to increase those means by creating circulating notes, the payment of which was not secured by any real capital, a discredit which had thus occasioned their embarrassment. Nevertheless, he came forward to the assistance of all, and threw open his coffers. He advanced them 6 or 7 millions of francs out of his own savings, in order to spare the commercial men of Paris and of many other large towns from the catastrophe which threatened them. This was the first time of my having any intercourse with Monsieur Lafitte, whom I had never yet been acquainted with, and who had been a long time at the head of Monsieur Perregaux's bank, particularly since the illness of the latter, which ended in his death. The emperor had often spoken in my presence of the commercial crisis. It had even been the subject of a discussion in the Council of State, and I could easily perceive that the emperor's language was in conformity with the reports he had received from various quarters, though none of them had carried conviction to his mind. I also perceived that when I was maintaining a discussion with my colleague, M. Moulin, the minister of the Treasury, who sat by my side, the emperor looked at me as if to spur me on. He was nevertheless aware that I was a perfect stranger to those matters, and I was apprehensive for a moment lest he should endeavor to persuade Moulin that I was the author of the reports. I therefore introduced in the discussion some ridiculous remark which had the effect of repairing my character. I was satisfied, however, that the emperor's look had some meaning in it, and as I was long aware of his preferring that his thoughts should be guessed than that he should be called upon to explain them, I set myself to work as soon as I left the council. I had kept up a friendly intercourse with Bourrienne. The emperor knew it, and took pleasure in listening to whatever I had to say when an opportunity offered for mentioning him, and I thus retained the hope of eventually procuring him a fresh appointment. Bourrienne knew better than I did the meaning of the emperor's look, and I fancied for a moment that he had some knowledge of the reports which had engaged the emperor's attention. After conversing with Bourrienne, I determined to seek some information from Monsieur Lafitte, whose opinion in the commercial world was already of so much the greater value as it rested upon the high independence of his personal character. The true origin of that consideration entertained for him, which has gone on increasing and strengthening itself by successive events. In case of arbitration, in which I felt much interested, and wished to have Monsieur Lafitte's opinion, served as a colorable pretense for requesting him, through Bourrienne, to favor me with a call. I had 3 points to discuss with him. First, the commercial crisis, with its causes and effects. Secondly, the continental system. And in the third place, the issuing of licenses. On listening to Monsieur Lafitte, I imbibed by degrees his own opinions, and if he should read my work, he will be able to judge if I have correctly retained them in my memory. I had several conversations with him wherein he fully developed his opinion, which I now submit to the reader's attention. Governments, he said, may lay down an infallible rule for forming a correct judgment of the progress of affairs and of public opinion, by considering that whatever is opposed to the interests of the community is necessarily also in opposition to their affections. An arbitrary conduct on the part of the administration destroys confidence and credit. A system of blockade is productive of no present good effect, and its natural consequence is to destroy all future commercial advantages. Commerce is quite inoffensive in its nature. It is friendly, too, because it needs the protection of government. It never assumes a character of opposition, except when it is exposed to vexatious proceedings, and possesses no guarantees for its stability. Those who can only prosper by the prevalence of order and tranquility can never be desirous of revolutions. The continental blockade is at first sight a mighty thought. Its theory presents to the mind a result as prompt as it is brilliant, but the flights of imagination are inapplicable to practical cases. The possibility of carrying the contemplated measure into effect is the first thing to be attended to. Some manufacturers may rejoice at the stimulus which that measure has given to their branch of industry, but The great body of mercantile men can only suffer from a commerce which is only carried on by means of licenses, and statesmen see in it nothing else than a concession made to the English of the commerce of the whole world. There can be no advantage in deceiving by empty words. Flattery may please the common run of princes, but truth alone is becoming to the emperor's genius. He ought therefore to be told that the blockade is a system of watchfulness extended over the continent and not over England. The continent alone is prevented from sending a ship to sea. The question being thus laid down, what will be the result of such a state of things? England will lose all the continental consumers, and the rest of the world will become tributaries to her undisputed monopoly. The continent, on the contrary, will supply its own wants without the intervention of England, and will be precluded from exchanging its productions with the rest of the world. The question is whether the European continent will itself sufficiently compensate for every other portion of the globe. This would have to be maturely considered if the blockade could be rendered effectual, but the licenses, which are actually granted, sufficiently prove that the question admits of a very different solution. France, which is a manufacturing country, will benefit by our expelling the English from the different markets of Europe, and this is her only compensation for the loss she must suffer by the cessation of all intercourse with America, Africa, and India. But what advantages will be derived by Spain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia from such a system? The existing state of things can only be productive of injury to them. How then can such an unnatural fabric rest upon any durable foundation? The complaints of subjects are not wholly without an influence over their respective governments when they are founded upon justice. They yield for a time to necessity, but there is a reaction of interests, and those interests become so clamorous that they must needs be attended to. Viewing then the question in this light, Monseigneur, every European power, however it may be ostensibly with us, is our secret enemy, and at heart the friend of England. Without keeping up any mutual intercourse, they understand each other and will not fail to break out on the first favorable opportunity. Russia in particular, which is the most powerful and the most aggrieved, ought to inspire us with such an apprehension, because she is unable to abide by the promises she has made. For my part, I am fully convinced that nothing can make up to her for the loss of English commerce. The losses felt by Russia are enormous, and they fall upon the high nobility and not upon the people. The nobility fill the court and the army, and a single fact will prove to you what are their intentions. Previously to the blockade, the ruble was worth 3 francs. It is now scarcely worth 20 souls. This consideration of existing difficulties must make us cast an anxious glance at futurity. The North hitherto supplied timber, hemp, and most essential articles for raising a navy. The English are now driven to the necessity of seeking for them in America. When new habits are thus contracted, they are never laid aside. Even the power of genius, Monseigneur, must bend to the force of circumstances. The licenses are proofs against the wisdom of the system. Nothing violent can possess any durability. Thus, therefore, the blockade has already been destroyed by the licenses. The licenses have done no more than to establish a privilege in commerce, and the tendency of this privilege is to secure an advantage to the English. Possessed as they are of every market, they alone have a right to purchase and sell. They refuse our goods and force upon us the produce of India and America. We pay, for instance, 6 francs for sugar, which they purchase for 8 or 9 souls at most. You must perceive that what is particularly evident in all this is the enormous profit derived by England. A few privileged merchants secure some gain to themselves by acting the part of intermediate agents, but they obtain it from the consumer, not at all from England. And be it always borne in mind that this consumer is a Frenchman. The system of licenses cannot deceive anyone. It strikes at the respectability of commerce by the frauds and impositions which are its necessary tenants, its discontents, allies, and natives, discriminately, by compelling them to pay 3 or 4 times the value of the goods. You are well aware that our exports do not tend to diminish the tribute thus paid to England. Almost every article of which they consist are stated at an extravagant price and put on board our ships for no other purpose than to be thrown into the sea. It would be better to keep them for the benefit of the poor. Be this as it may, everything can be summed up in a few words. The blockade and the licenses come to this. The English sell everything to the continent without purchasing any goods in return. Having the terms of purchase in another quarter and of sale with us at their own option, they realize a double profit without encountering the slightest opposition. France, on the contrary, manufactures to no purpose, since her goods are often doomed to destruction. She may indeed gain some profit from foreigners by reselling them to the imported produce, but those foreigners are our own allies, and the blockade thus presses with additional weight upon them. They lose upon their goods for which they can find no purchaser, and they lose upon colonial produce, which they can only procure from ourselves. Such a state of things cannot last. Prussia, Austria, and Russia will, in their turn, insist upon granting licenses. The English are aware that our allies are well inclined towards them, and they will not reject any friendly offer. Discontent and reproaches will soon break out. The blockade will become a mere name. Our allies will, in spite of us, draw near to our enemies, and fresh wars will perhaps again place our future prospects in jeopardy. So long as peace shall be indefinitely postponed, the country cannot well prosper, nor can confidence exist. Glory alone is not sufficient for a nation. The emperor's share of it is imperishable, but we naturally desire to see general happiness and tranquility in its train. The blockade, therefore, as I have already stated, is viewed by us statesmen as a gigantic and bold project, but which can never be attended with success. The system of licenses, the main object of which is to exchange manufactured goods, which we have largely accumulated, against the articles of primary necessity we stand so much in need of. That system was a just one. It has, however, degenerated by a series of abuses into a disgraceful privilege. Those alone who obtain licenses have an interest in applauding the measure. Let us not deceive ourselves. It is not this transitory evil of a blockade which spreads alarm and discouragement. The emperor is possessed of the genius and knowledge which give him the power to conciliate everything. The evil proceeds perhaps from some unfair prejudices instilled into his mind during his first campaigns. Judging of the mass by the exceptions, he perhaps confounds the financier with the farmer of public revenues, and the merchant with certain contractors. This is no doubt the origin of the arbitrary measures of the administration. The breach of promises is placed by a series of reprisals as a set-off against fraudulent acts. Good faith, which infuses a vital spirit wherever it has any influence, is nowhere found to exist. The comparative state of French and English credit is a humiliating fact which may serve as a key to many others. The English debt amounts to 18 or 19,000 millions of francs. Ours is only 1,200 or 1,300 millions, and yet the English would be enabled, in case of need, to borrow much larger sums than we could obtain upon credit, and above all, they could borrow on much more advantageous terms. Whence arises the difference? Why is the credit of the state at a lower ebb in France than that of the principal bankers and merchants, whilst the reverse is invariably the case in England? The problem may be solved in a few words. In England, a sure way to recover lost credit is to transact business with the government. A similar course in France never fails to destroy private credit. England may be taken in the mass for a vast commercial concern, the partners of which are the ministers, the laws, its partnership contract, which defies the attack of power. With us, on the contrary, the Council of State usurps the authority of the tribunals. And I might almost venture to assert that nothing useful is carried into effect because nothing rests upon a solid guarantee. Monsieur Lafitte afterwards discussed at great length the causes and effects of the crisis, which he neither found to originate in the consequences of the blockade nor in some wild gambling speculations. He supported his reasoning by facts and explained to me the measures which ought to be adopted in order the government might be enabled to wield all its power by taking advantage of the prodigious means at its command. And as he spoke, I felt myself carried along with him by the soundness of his reasoning. I will not endeavor to relate his arguments because I might not state them with sufficient accuracy, and there is no longer a question of putting them into practice. As I was desirous, however, bestowing all my attention to the subject and was unable to do so at the moment, I resolved to see him again, and resolved for the present, from all I had learned, to exert all my influence in order to prevail on the emperor to grant the immediate assistance which several commercial establishments had prayed for. This assistance was only considered by Monsieur Lafitte in the light of a palliative remedy, which did not at all remove the main objections of the system pursued. Nevertheless, he highly applauded it and the temporary advantages which he anticipated from thence, and actually developed to me, explained the meaning of a multitude of reports which daily reached my ears, and were wrapped up in the language of mysterious hints. These conversations with Monsieur Lafitte having made me better acquainted with our existing condition, I requested he would commit his sentiments to paper. He yielded to my request, and I handed this note to the emperor. One of his ministers having accidentally made a report to him on the same day concerning the prohibitory measures adopted, the emperor grew angry and said in full council, "With all your measures, you destroy the commerce of France." Subsequently to this circumstance, he evinced great readiness to afford aid to all establishments of undoubted respectability which had felt the effects of the crisis. The applications for money became at last so frequent as to make him deeply reflect on our condition. He had an opportunity of discovering the correctness of Monsieur Lafitte's opinions when he saw Monsieur Oberkampf, the manufacturer, on the eve of a bankruptcy. He sent for him and desired he would draw all the money he stood in need of to prevent such a misfortune and to enable his manufactories to proceed. His liberality prevented the failure of that house. The first Paris establishment which was under the necessity of soliciting assistance was the firm of Turton Ravel. It was certainly not justified in relying upon the emperor's bounty, considering its conduct toward him in the affair of General Moreau. Nevertheless, it had not to wait 24 hours for the relief applied for, and became indebted for the loan of a large sum, for the reimbursement of which it entered into such arrangements with the Minister of the Treasury as suited its own convenience. I was the person to whom Monsieur Turton came to confide his embarrassment, delivering into my hands at the same time a letter for the emperor, and my only reason for naming him is that he was yet indebted a considerable portion of the money when he showed himself conspicuous amongst those who brought about the emperor's downfall at the period of the first occupation of Paris. The firm of Simon became bankrupt at the time of the crisis above mentioned and applied for assistance, which was refused because it did not offer any adequate moral guarantee for the repayment. By the disaster which befell that house, Monsieur de Talleyrand, according to what was reported to me at that time, lost 1,400,000 francs. His affairs were then in a very indifferent state, and his revenue was hardly sufficient to pay the interest of the money. Owing to his creditors, he became reduced to the allowance made to him by the emperor, and had the mortification of being hard-pressed by creditors who, being likewise in want of money, threatened to prevent inaction against him. I had to interfere in order to prevent a publicity which would have been wholly unexampled for a man of his rank. He was compelled to borrow 100,000 crowns from a banking house which soon afterwards failed. His situation was truly deplorable. He came to explain it to me and to request I would prevail on the emperor to purchase his residence, formerly the Hôtel de Valentinois, in the Rue de Varennes. The emperor had no reason to be pleased with him. Public report had ascribed to Monsieur de Talleyrand many expressions injurious to the character of the sovereign. He may never have uttered them, but if they were not to be visited upon him, neither was there any motive for affording him relief. The emperor was, however, reluctant that a man who had been of service to him should remain in so painful a situation, and although he had no occasion for the Hotel of Valentinois, he caused it to be visited and estimated by Mr. Fontaine, the architect of the Palace of the Tuileries, the Louvre, St. Cloud, etc. The architect named by Mr. de Talleyrand drew up a counter-estimate on behalf of his employer, and upon their report, the emperor purchased the hotel ready furnished and paid for it the sum of 2,100,000 francs in ready money. Notwithstanding the sale, Monsieur de Talleyrand removed as much of the furniture as he was enabled to find room for in the new hotel he had purchased at the corner of the Rue Saint-Florentin. He transacted on that occasion a business of a double nature with equal satisfaction to himself, because the new hotel belonged to the former Spanish ambassador, with whom Monsieur de Talleyrand had an account to settle. He received the hotel in lieu of a sum of money which he might not have been able to recover until its sale should have been effected. I mention this anecdote because the emperor was accused of having seized upon Monsieur de Talleyrand's hotel after he had completely fitted up. Ask every man a sense if any one would have been found to pay 2,100,000 francs for a house which Monsieur de Talleyrand was anxious to dispose of, and whether the emperor, who was at a loss what to do with it after effecting the purchase, could be influenced by any other motive than a desire to assist Monsieur de Talleyrand by taking it off his hands. At this period, I also witnessed another proof of the emperor's kindness, which was evinced towards a person who has probably been in ignorance of it, as I was desired not to mention the subject. Many circumstances now justify me in divulging the secret. When Mr. Fouché quitted the Ministry of Police, he was possessed of considerable sums of money, and did so little justice to the emperor as to feel apprehensive of their being taken from him. He had placed a greater reliance in the honesty of a mere agent of police named Dumont, one of his dependents. At the moment of his taking his departure for Italy, he entrusted that the agent with a large sum of money, of which he never could recover back any portion. This agent died soon afterwards, leaving a widow and 2 children in a state absolute. This woman, being ignorant of what had passed between Mr. Fouché and her husband, it was natural for her to expect the production of a receipt, which she might well suppose her husband to have given for the money deposited in his hands. Had she done so, it would have been impossible, in the absence of any receipt, to make her restore the money which she found at her husband's death, especially as the claimants were desirous of avoiding the publicity which the transaction would necessarily create. I was informed of the fact by some of Monsieur Fouché's friends, and had an opportunity the same night of mentioning it to the emperor, who ordered me to exert every means in my power to secure Monsieur Fouché from all loss. I had no difficulty in accomplishing that object, as the widow was an honest woman, who restored the deposit on the first application made to her. Nevertheless, Madame Fouché, who had not followed her husband to Italy, and who was a lady of sound sense, was too well aware of the danger he had incurred not to be deeply sensible of the kind of intentions manifested by the emperor on the occasion. She came to request I would solicit an audience of the emperor on her behalf. It was granted, and she did not fail to return him her grateful acknowledgment for so signal a mark of favor. Chapter 10. For upwards of a 12-month, it had been remarked that a certain Russian officer was seen to return from France to Russia and regularly back to Paris. As soon as he had brought a reply to St. Petersburg, it was jocosely said that, in all probability, no one else had found acquainted with the road. Others, however, remarked with better reason that the circumstance of the journey, being always performed by the same officer, was not without a particular motive. In fact, from the month of March 1808 until February 1812, a period of 4 years, he traveled 10 or 12 times from Russia to Paris, a distance equivalent to a voyage round the world, which it takes a ship 3 years to perform. Towards the end of 1810, I stumbled by pure accident upon a proof that the precipitate return of this officer had a much more important object in view than the compliments and assurances of friendly sentiments which might be conveyed by the letters entrusted to his care. His intervals of leisure between the time of his arrival and departure were engaged in studies which were calculated to impose upon all who might have pretended to assign a different motive to his missions. When seeking, however, for a teacher of mathematics, he found in the object of his choice one of those men who are known at the police by the name of observers. The latter accepted his offer, feeling delighted at an opportunity which promised so rich a harvest. After the lapse of a short time, the Russian officer tried to discover the means of information possessed by his tutor, and asked him if he was acquainted with any of the clerks in the offices of the War Department. The teacher of mathematics replied in the affirmative, which was really the case, but before committing himself any farther, the Russian officer promised that when proof should be afforded by his telling the truth, he would put him in the way of making money. The teacher made me acquainted with this proposal, which I desired him to accept, and to do everything that might be asked of him after giving me due intimation of what was going forward. He went in consequence to visit the acquaintances he had in the war offices, and obtained some private documents or printed papers which sufficiently proved that he possessed some means of access to the ministry. He brought me those documents, in which I altered a few figures and returned them to him for the inspection of the Russian officer. This information inspired the latter with confidence, and he gave his mathematician a note containing a series of questions in his own handwriting, all having for the object to search in the offices of the War Department of everything connected with the personnel and materiel of the French armies. This note was immediately brought to me, and left no longer any doubt as to the grounds of the confidence reposed in the Russian officer by his government, and the part he was expected to act in Paris. I reported the circumstance to the Emperor, who at first refused to credit it, but who became convinced when he saw the series of questions in the handwriting of the Russian officer. He enjoined me not to say a word on the subject, but sent him off the next day, or the day following, with a letter for the Emperor of Russia. The emperor was far from imagining that an aide-de-camp of the Emperor Alexander, who was admitted and welcomed everywhere in that character, should have been placed near his person for the purpose also of observing what was going forward. He had therefore the more readily afforded him every means of carrying his ostensible mission into effect, and that the officer was received everywhere. In consequence of the emperor's having personally recommended to every circle of society that great attention should be shown to him, so that all were eager to pay deference to a hint which afforded the means of pleasing the sovereign by complying with his wishes. I recollect that, on the officer's departure, the emperor recommended a letter to be written to his own ambassador, in order that the obstacles might be thrown in the way of his return. The sequel of the story will show that his desire cannot have been attended to. It was during the autumnal residence of the court at Fontainebleau that the emperor intimated to the Emperor of Russia's aide-de-camp that he was going to send him back to St. Petersburg, and he gave him a long audience, in which he very properly told the emperor that the best commission he could take back to his master was the assurances that no conscription was intended to be called out in the present year. The emperor himself repeated these words to me.